Someone left a 2-month-old white shepherd puppy under the stairs of a private jet in Palm Springs and decided that was goodbye. He pressed his tiny body into the cold metal beside a wheel taller than I am, trying to disappear before anyone noticed he'd been thrown away. Palm Springs' noon light doesn't hide much. It bounced off the jets and hot concrete, turning the hangar into a bright box that smelled like fuel and money. I was halfway through my walk under the wings when I heard it. Not a bark, just a thin sound from under the metal stairs of the private jet. You only notice a sound like that if you've loved a dog long enough to hear when it's given up calling. I stopped in the middle of the floor and bent down into the shadow beneath the steps. He was there, curled where the lowest step met the concrete, a tiny white body pressed flat against the steel. Next to the gleaming landing gear, he looked even smaller, a shaking scrap of fur with dusty paws splayed on the floor. Every time metal clanged, his claws twitched once, like his body wanted to run, and his fear wouldn't let it move. I went to my knees so he didn't have to stare up at another tall shape and held out my hand, slow and empty. When my fingers reached the warmth of his trembling side, he jolted, but his eyes didn't flick to my face. They shot past my shoulder, straight up the stairs above us, locked on the place where boots would have appeared before they walked away. Someone didn't lose a puppy under that jet. They walked down those steps, set him there, and decided that was all the goodbye he deserved. You don't leave a puppy like that by accident. So I stayed on my knees, palms flat on the warm concrete, trying to make myself smaller than the metal around us. Up close, he was even tinier. A 2-month-old white German Shepherd puppy with a body that looked like it belonged on someone's lap, not under aircraft stairs. His fur was dirty along his belly where he'd pressed into the floor, like he'd been trying to sink right into the cement. "Hey, buddy," I said, keeping my voice low, the way you talk to something breakable. $1 million jet and they couldn't afford to keep you on board, huh? The sarcasm was for whoever had walked down those steps and kept going. Every word, every pause was for him. I saw the collar when he shifted, just a little. Leather, soft, expensive, the kind people buy to match their shoes. The ring where a name tag should have hung was empty, the metal still shiny where something had been twisted off. Somebody had made sure he didn't have a name anymore before they left him here. I eased one hand back and reached into my vest for the half sandwich I hadn't finished at lunch. I tore off a small piece and laid it on my open palm, arms stretched out so he could come to me or not. Above us, a hangar door slammed and he flinched so hard his claws scraped the floor. Voices echoed, laughter from the jet, the kind of sound rich people make when they're already thinking about their next destination. He stretched his neck forward, trembling, nose working over the air between us. His tongue finally brushed the food, the smallest careful lick, but his eyes never left the stairs. Right there, with him shaking under someone else's jet, I made up my mind. If they left you here like this, I'm the one who's taking you out, whether anyone upstairs likes it or not. He didn't move until I slid my hands under his belly and lifted him off the concrete. He was lighter than he looked, all bones and breath and worry, a little white shepherd puppy folded against my chest like he'd already learned to make himself small. I wrapped him in my reflective vest, the one that's supposed to keep me safe out on the tarmac, and for a second it felt like that was finally true for somebody. We walked out from under the belly of that jet into the open hangar. On one side, a line of cars that cost more than my house waited with their doors open. Pilots walked past in crisp uniforms. Ground crew pushed carts. Someone laughed into a phone about missing a spa appointment. No one looked twice at the bundle in my arms. In a building full of people, the only one who seemed to see this shaken little life was the guy whose job is to watch the planes. There's a small room off the main corridor where we keep the things people forget. Suitcases, strollers, the occasional cat carrier, a couple of metal cages stacked against the wall. I set him down on a towel and filled a bowl from the sink, sliding it close enough that his nose bumped the rim. He drank like he wasn't sure it would be there the next second, tongue flicking fast, water dripping from his chin into the dust in his fur. No cuts, no broken skin, just a white coat grayed by the hangar floor and a kind of tired in his eyes I usually only see in old dogs. I called the local rescue we work with and gave them the short version. Puppy, maybe 2 months, white German Shepherd puppy, left under a jet stairway in a private hangar. They sighed the way people do when they've heard too many stories like that and told me the truth. Either someone picks him up today, or you keep him until we find a spot because we are full. Later, one of the ground crew pulled me aside. He'd heard the radio chatter from the cabin before departure. Someone up there had asked them to take care of the puppy. We've got 20 minutes before wheels up. We both knew what that meant now. Security pulled the camera footage while I stood in that little room with his damp whiskers resting on my boot. On the screen, an elegant figure in designer clothes came down the stairs, set a tiny shape at the bottom, and went back up without looking down. The door closed, the jet moved, and for one awful second, you could see him try to follow, stumbling after the retreating shadow before the metal shut in his face. I watched that loop and looked at the dog pressed against my leg. "All right, kid," I whispered. "You're not theirs anymore. To hell with people who can walk away like that." Shelter meant a metal door and a concrete run, if they even had room tonight. He was already small enough. I couldn't stand the thought of him shrinking into the back of a crowded kennel on his first night off the hangar floor. So I signed the papers to hold him temporarily and carried that little white German Shepherd puppy out to my old car like it was the only thing I owned that mattered. In the passenger seat, he wouldn't lie down. He sat sideways, claws dug into the cracked vinyl, staring straight ahead. Every time a jet rolled by on the taxiway and the engines hummed low through the glass, his whole body flinched. He didn't cry, didn't bark, just tightened up, like the sound itself could reach back under those stairs and grab him again. I drove slower than I needed to, one hand on the wheel, one hand resting where he could touch it if he wanted. My place isn't much. Little kitchen, old couch with one good cushion, a bedroom that smells more like coffee than cologne. After the bright metal and polished leather of that hangar, it probably looked like another planet. I carried him straight to the bathroom and turned on the warm water, letting the steam fill the room before I even set him down. He trembled when his paws hit the tub, but he didn't fight. I used the mild soap I keep for the foster dogs and worked the dust out of his fur in slow circles. At some point, his head bumped into my chest and stayed there, tiny skull pressed against my shirt while the water ran past us. I could feel his heartbeat through wet fur and cotton, quick and stubborn, refusing to quit even after everything. That night, I made him a bed out of an old blanket right beside mine. I told myself it was better if he learned not to sleep on the furniture, that this was just for one night. I turned off the light, lay down, and let the quiet settle. A couple of minutes later, something warm leaned into my foot. Then a small paw hooked gently around my toes, holding on like I was the edge of the world. I'd felt that same grip once before in another lifetime, from another dog who never understood why people could be so careless with hearts like his. The anger hit me low and slow, not hot, just heavy, aimed squarely at the ones who walked away from this little life under a jet. I stared into the dark and listened to his breathing steady out beside my bed. If I tell myself this is only for tonight, I thought, I'm not being honest with either of us. Morning found him already awake. He was sitting at the edge of the blanket, ears a little crooked, watching me like he was waiting for instructions on how to exist. When I stood up, he followed, careful, placing his paws like each step needed permission. He padded into the kitchen, sniffed the chair legs, bumped his nose on a cabinet door, then tried to walk through the doorway a little too fast and clipped the threshold with his front paw. He stumbled, recovered, shook it off like a tiny white German Shepherd puppy with more dignity than weight, then glanced back at me to see if I'd laugh. I didn't. I just told him, "You're doing fine," because he was. There are 3 steps down from my hallway to the little living room. He stopped at the top of them like he was looking over the edge of a cliff. Head low, shoulders tight, eyes fixed on that first drop, the same way he'd stared at the metal stairs under the jet. His nails clicked once on the wood, then he backed up and sat down, chest rising fast. While he thought it over, I called the shelter from the kitchen. They knew the story already. They also knew their own capacity. "If you can hang on to him a little while," they said, "we'll work on a permanent placement. He needs a home, at least for now. I told them I could hold him until someone better showed up. Even saying it out loud, the words didn't sit right. When I came back, he was still at the top of those 3 little steps, gathering himself like they were 30. He lifted one paw, set it on the first tread, then pulled it back so fast you'd think it burned. Before I could think about it, the words were already out of my mouth. "Easy, Nimbus. You don't have to climb that today." I froze halfway through the sentence. Nimbus. I don't know where it came from. Just a soft little cloud of a word that seemed to fit this white pup in a hot desert town. He turned his head at the sound like someone had touched him. Those dark eyes found mine and held, steady for the first time since I'd seen him under the stairs, like he was trying the name on from the inside. Later, when I grabbed my keys for the afternoon shift, I told myself, again, this was temporary. Just a favor to the rescue until someone with a bigger house and a cleaner life took him. I stepped outside and pulled the door almost shut, then glanced back through the narrow slice of glass. He was sitting by the window, ears forward, staring toward the distant rumble of a plane lifting off over Palm Springs. It was the same sound that used to make him flinch, and now he just watched it go. Looks like we're both heading back to the place that hurt us, I thought. And walking to the car, I knew this just for now story I was telling myself had already stopped being true. After my shift, I didn't even take my boots off. I just clipped the leash on Nimbus, scooped him up, and headed back out the door. If we were going to figure out his future, it needed to start with someone checking that little body from nose to tail. The shelter hit us before we even stepped inside. Barking, overlapping and out of rhythm, the smell of cleaner trying and failing to fight the weight of too many dogs in too little space. Nimbus tucked himself closer to my leg, white fur brushing my pant leg with every hesitant step. He wasn't shaking like he had under the jet, but his chest moved a little faster. Inside was chaos with heart. Metal kennels crammed along the walls, volunteers in worn t-shirts moving as fast as they could, staff with tired eyes still smiling at every wagging tail. A tech ran gentle hands over Nimbus, checked his teeth, his ears, his heartbeat. "Physically," she said, "for a 2-month-old white German Shepherd puppy, he's in decent shape." Then she sighed. "Emotionally, that's the part we can't x-ray." At the front desk, they pulled up the notes tied to that private flight. "Here," the woman said, turning the monitor a little. "Initial booking has a service animal / pet listed." She clicked again, eyebrows tightening. "Departure manifest? Nothing. Somebody made sure he vanished on paper before they took off." She leaned back, rubbing a hand over her face. "Sometimes people think of dogs the same way they think of luggage," she said quietly. "If it doesn't match the trip anymore, they just leave it." In the distance, a plane climbed out over Palm Springs, low rumble rolling over the parking lot and through the thin shelter walls. Nimbus pressed into my shin at that sound, ribs expanding against my jeans, eyes flicking toward the door like he half expected metal stairs to appear again. For a moment, I saw him as I'd first found him, wedged into shadow under a jet, trying to outrun the sound with his heartbeat. One of the staff watched him, then looked at me. "We can take him," she said softly. "If that's what you want, we'll find him a home when we have space." She paused, then added, "Or you can keep caring for him yourself. You pulled him out of that hangar. Shepherds don't forget that kind of thing. You give them safety, they give you every bit of loyalty they have for the rest of their life." I looked down at Nimbus, at his pale face and those dark, steady eyes that weren't empty anymore. He didn't know the words, but he knew my answer long before I said anything. Time has a way of stitching torn things back together when a dog is in the house. A few weeks later, Nimbus moved through my place like he'd always lived there. He knew where the water bowl was, which corner the sun hit in the afternoon, and that the sound of the coffee maker meant I wasn't going anywhere just yet. We still went to the shelter a couple of times a week so he could meet new people and sounds without the echo of a hangar hanging over his head. One afternoon, we walked in on a different kind of heartbreak. A woman sat in a plastic chair by the intake desk, clutching the leash of an old gray-muzzled dog like it was a lifeline. Her shoulders shook while she tried to explain about medical bills and rent and a landlord who had changed his mind. The staff listened with that quiet, tired kindness you only see in people who've heard this story too many times. Nimbus watched from my side for a moment, ears tipped forward. Then, without a word from me, he patted over on those careful paws of his. He rested his chin on her knee like he'd been assigned the job. She startled, then broke, folding down over him, fingers disappearing into his white fur. "Thank you, little guy," she whispered into the top of his head, tears darkening his coat. I stood there and realized this wasn't just a scared pup learning to feel safe. There was something in him that moved toward pain instead of away from it. A white German Shepherd puppy who knew exactly where to put his weight so a breaking heart didn't feel like it was falling alone. Sometimes, on my way to or from a shift, I'd bring him by the airport for just a minute. We'd stand well back from the runway, near the fence line, and he'd sit beside me watching the planes climb. He still tensed at the first low roar of the engines, but the trembling faded quicker now. Mostly he just stared, like he was measuring the distance between the life that left him and the one he'd landed in. One evening a coworker spotted us out there, Nimbus leaning against my leg while a jet rolled past. "You know," he said, nodding toward the dog, "he'd make a hell of an airport therapy dog." I laughed it off in the moment, but the words stuck the whole drive home. The thing about fear is sometimes it points exactly where you need to go. After that comment from my coworker, I called a local nonprofit that runs an airport comfort dog program and told them about Nimbus. They already knew his story from the rescue. They said if a white German Shepherd puppy could face what he'd faced and still walk toward people, they wanted to meet him. So a week later, we were in a quiet corner of the terminal, far from the gates, just a couple of trainers, a few volunteers, and him. The first session was simple. Let strangers walk past, let a hand reach out slowly, let a soft voice say his name and offer a treat. He watched everything, those dark eyes taking in exits and angles, but his tail gave a small, uncertain sway when someone laughed. You could almost see him weighing each human, deciding if they were the kind that left you or the kind that stayed. When they said he was ready for the next step, I knew what it had to be. We drove out toward the private side of the airport, the part most people never see. The smell of kerosene met us before we even reached the gate, that heavy, sharp scent that sticks to your clothes. Inside, the familiar drone of big air conditioners filled the hangar, bouncing off metal walls and polished wings. The light flashed off chrome and paint, just like the day I found him. We stopped a good distance from the same style of jet, the same set of metal stairs leading up into money and comfort. Nimbus froze when he saw the layout, ears flattening, chest rising fast. His leash tightened for a second, not because I pulled, but because his body wanted to turn away. So I sat down on the concrete beside him. Didn't coax, didn't push. I just put my hand on the ground where he could feel it and breathed slow, loud enough for him to hear the rhythm. We stayed like that for a while. Two shapes on the floor of a place that had once decided he was disposable. Little by little, his muscles loosened. He took one small step forward, then another, nails clicking softly on the smooth floor. He stopped near the landing gear, close enough that he could have touched the tire if he wanted. Still shaking, but planted. He wasn't hiding this time. "You're braver than anyone who walked down those stairs," I whispered. And sitting there beside him, I realized we were both already headed straight toward whatever came next. By the time a month had passed, the scared little shadow under the jet stairs had turned into an official comfort dog with a badge on his vest. Through the rescue and a local nonprofit, Nimbus was cleared to work the terminal with me a few hours a week. My name is Wes, by the way, and on those days it felt like I was just the guy holding the leash for a white German Shepherd puppy who understood people better than most adults I know. We'd walk the concourse slow, not in a hurry to get anywhere. One afternoon, a boy sat near a gate, sneakers bouncing so hard his whole chair shook. Nimbus watched him for a beat, then drifted over and parked himself at the kid's feet. He didn't do anything fancy, just leaned in until his fur brushed the boy's leg. The tapping slowed, then stopped. A small hand found its way into that white coat and stayed there until it was time to board. Another time, an older man stood alone, ticket crumpled in his fist like it was trying to escape. His eyes were on the runway, but his mind was somewhere else. Nimbus walked up, set one paw dead center on the man's shoe, and sat like a little anchor. No tricks, no commands, just weight and presence. The man let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped for years and whispered, "Okay, buddy, okay." I used to joke that Nimbus didn't know a thing about airplanes, but he was better at keeping people safe than any safety card in a seat pocket. Word got around. A local news crew came out one morning, filmed him greeting passengers, told the story of the rescued white shepherd puppy helping nervous flyers at the Palm Springs airport. The clip hit social media and took off faster than anything I've ever seen with wings. A few days later, during a lull on the ramp, one of the ground crew nudged me and nodded toward Nimbus lying by my boots. "Hey," he said, "didn't that rich family from New York fly out on that same jet the day he showed up?" He tapped his tablet, scanning the schedule. "You know what's funny? They're on here again, same tail number, landing next week." The day that jet came back, my hands shook more than they ever have during an inspection. Nimbus thought it was just another shift. He trotted beside me into the lounge on the private side, vest on, tail giving that calm little sway he'd learned. We did our usual slow circuit, letting people notice him if they needed a distraction more than a drink. He settled by my chair while I pretended to read a clipboard and tried not to look at the window where the familiar tail number had just rolled into view. The plane parked in the same hangar as before. Doors opened, the metal stairs dropped, and the flow of money and perfume and luggage started. Designer sneakers on kids, high heels, suits, a nanny with a bag bigger than Nimbus when I first carried him out of there. They walked in talking about golf and reservations, not about anything they might have left behind. Then one of the kids stopped dead. "Wait," he said, voice cracking up into a shout. "That's him. That's our puppy from here. He's alive." Every head turned toward the white shepherd puppy lying at my feet. The parents moved fast, faces rearranging into something soft. They talked about chaos, about how they had lost him that day in all the rush, how heartbroken they'd been. I heard every word and saw the camera footage in my mind instead, the neat way someone had set him under those stairs and walked away. They called to him, hands out, voices bright and excited. If he'd launched himself across the room into their arms, it would have been a different story. But Nimbus stiffened. His ears slid back, and he took 2 small steps behind my legs, pressing his chest into the back of my knees. The boy came closer, eyes wet, holding out his fingers. Nimbus leaned forward just enough to lick them once, gentle, like he was touching an old photograph. Then he turned away from that past and laid his head firmly across my boot. Nobody raised their voice. No one made a scene. It was just quiet and heavy and true. "He's registered with the rescue now," I said, steady, looking at the adults. "He's got a home. He's not a thing you left under the stairs." They walked out with their bags and their stories, but no dog. And in the silence that followed, all I could feel was the weight of Nimbus, choosing where he belonged. Time does a funny thing when you measure it in dog years and airport shifts. Nimbus filled out but didn't lose the softness in his eyes. He still had the bounce of a young dog at home, stealing socks from the laundry basket and collapsing across the couch like he'd paid the mortgage. But the second his vest went on, that same white shepherd puppy turned into a little professional who knew exactly where fear hangs the heaviest in a terminal. On a training day, a rookie pilot sat in a corner of the lounge, jacket folded over his knees, staring a hole through the runway. Nimbus walked straight over, circled once, and dropped at his boots, chin resting on the man's laces. No fanfare, just quiet weight saying, "You're allowed to be scared." Later, we passed a woman clutching a cat carrier like it might float away. She kept looking between the gate and the crate, eyes shiny. Nimbus eased up beside her and pressed his side against her leg until her shoulders dropped. She reached through the bars to touch her cat with one hand and buried the other in his fur. We even went back through the same hangar, past the place under the stairs where I'd first found him. He glanced at it once in passing, then kept moving, more interested in the mechanic who wanted to say hello. The rescue told me donations had gone up after his story aired. They could take in a couple more hard cases now, because Thrown Away Dog had shown people what second chances look like. That night, he fell asleep on my chest, head tucked under my chin, breathing slow and easy. All the jets in Palm Springs could roar at once, and it still wouldn't sound as rich as that. Lying there, I knew I wasn't the same man who'd walked that hangar alone the first time I heard him cry. Every time I walk past those metal stairs now, I see two dogs in the same shadow: the tiny shaking puppy with his ribs pressed into the concrete, and the one he became, walking past that spot like it can't touch him anymore. Nimbus started as a quiet shape under a private jet in Palm Springs, a forgotten 2-month-old bundle of white fur left to shiver beside a wheel. No toys, no bed, no name. Just engines screaming overhead and a door closing while he tried to follow. Now that same rescued puppy moves through the terminal with his vest on, tail steady, changing the day for people who can barely get themselves to the gate. The kid whose leg won't stop bouncing. The pilot who hides his shaking hands. The woman whispering goodbye to a cat through crate bars. He leans his weight into them the way he hooked that tiny paw over my toes on our first night, like he's saying, "Hold on, I've got you." Because of him, the shelter that almost didn't have room now says yes to dogs that used to be told no. The extra dog, the older dog, the scared dog. A white shepherd puppy who was once treated like luggage is now the reason other dogs get to stay alive long enough to be loved. This little guy's journey from abandonment to rehabilitation shows how important nonprofit rescue groups really are. They stepped in when someone else stepped away. They helped a terrified airport pup become the dog people look for when their courage starts to slip. Caring for a rescued puppy is more than love. It's responsibility. It's pet care. It's choosing not to walk past the sound of a dog crying under the stairs. It's deciding that even one small life on a concrete floor is worth stopping your whole day. Maybe you've never stood under a private jet. Maybe you've never lifted a shaking body out of a place it was never supposed to be left. But if Nimbus has put that tight knot in your throat, you're already part of his story. When you share it, when you comment, when you send it to another dog person, you're not just spreading a video, you're opening a door under somebody else's staircase. You're the reason the next scared pup in a loud, bright place gets seen in time. Join our Brave Paws family. Be their voice. Be their hope.